That night, I had the most hideous dreams. No wonder. All the evening I had oppressed them by memories of my miserable days at school, and I could not shake them off. I was sent to the school by distant relations upon whom I was dependent and of whom I have heard nothing since. They sent me there a forlorn, silent boy, already crushed by their reproaches, already troubled by doubt, and looking with savage distrust at everyone. My schoolfellows met me with spiteful and merciless jibes because I was not like any of them. But I could not endure their taunts. I could not give in to them with the ignoble readiness with which they gave in to one another. I hated them for the first, and shut myself away from everyone in timid, wounded, and disproportionate pride. Their coarseness revolted me. They laughed cynically at my face, at my clumsy figure, and yet what stupid faces they had themselves. In our school, the boys' faces seemed in a special way to degenerate and grow stupider. How many fine-looking boys came to us? In a few years they became repulsive. Even at 16, I wondered at them morosely. Even when I was struck by the pettiness of their thoughts, the stupidity of their pursuits, their games, their conversations. They had no understanding of such essential things. They took no interest in such striking, imperative subjects that I could not help considering them inferior to myself. It was not wounded vanity that drove me to it, and for God's sake, do not trust upon me your hackneyed remarks repeated to nausea, that I was only a dreamer, while they even then had an understanding of life. They understood nothing. They had no idea of real life, and I swear that that was what made me most indignant with them. On the contrary, the most obvious, striking reality they accepted with fantastic stupidity. And even at that time were accustomed to respect success. Everything that was just, but oppressed and looked down upon, they laughed at, heartlessly and shamefully. They took rank for intelligence. Even at 16, they were already talking about a snug berth. Of course, a great deal of it was due to their stupidity, to the bad examples with which they had always been surrounded in their childhood and boyhood. They were monstrously depraved. Of course, a great deal of that too was superficial, an assumption of cynicism. Of course, there were glimpses of youth and freshness even in their depravity, but even that freshness was not attractive and showed itself in a certain rakishness. I hated them horribly, though perhaps I was worse than any of them. They repaid me in the same way, and did not conceal their aversion for me. But by then I did not desire their affection. On the contrary, I continually longed for their humiliation. To escape from their derision, I purposely began to make all the progress I could with my studies and forced my way to the very top. This impressed them. Moreover, they all began by degrees to grasp that I had already read books none of them could read, and understood things not forming part of our school curriculum, of which they had not even heard. They took a savage and sarcastic view of it, but were morally impressed, especially as the teachers began to notice me on those grounds. The mockery ceased, but the hostility remained, and cold and strained relations became permanent between us. In the end, I could not put up with it, with years a craving for society, for friends, developed in me. I attempted to get on friendly terms with some of my schoolfellows, but somehow or other my intimacy with them was always strained and soon ended of itself. Once indeed I did not have a friend. Once indeed I did have a friend, but I was already a tyrant at heart. I wanted to exercise unbound sway over him. I tried to instill into him a contempt for his surroundings. I required of him a disdainful and complete break with those surroundings. I frightened him with my passionate affection. I reduced him to tears, to hysterics. He was a simple and devoted soul, but when he devoted himself to me entirely, I began to hate him immediately and repulsed him, as though all I needed him for was to win a victory over him, to subjugate him and nothing else, but I could not subjugate all of them. My friend was not at all like them either. He was in fact a rare exception. The first thing I did on leaving school was to give up the special job for which I had been destined so as to break all ties, to curse my past and to shake the dust from off my feet. And goodness knows why, after all that, I should go trudging off to Simonov's. Early next morning, I roused myself and jumped out of bed with excitement, as though it were all about to happen at once. But I believed that some radical change in my life was coming and would inevitably come that day, owing to its rarity. Perhaps any external event, however trivial, always made me feel as though some radical change in my life were at hand. I went to the office, however, as usual, but sneaked away home 2 hours earlier to get ready. The great thing, I thought, is not to be the first to arrive, or they will think I am overjoyed at coming. But there were thousands of such great points to consider, and they all agitated and overwhelmed me. I polished my boots a second time with my own hands. Nothing in the world would have induced Apollon to clean them twice a day, as he considered that it was more than his duties required of him. I stole the brushes to clean them from the passage, being careful he would not and should not detect it, for fear of his contempt. Then I minutely examined my clothes and thought that everything looked old, worn, and threadbare. I had let myself get too slovenly. My uniform perhaps was tidy, but I could not go out to dinner in my uniform. The worst of it was that on the knee of the trousers was a big yellow stain. I had a foreboding that that stain would deprive me of 9/10 of my personal dignity. I knew, too, that it was very poor to think so, but this is no time for thinking. Now I am in for the real thing, I thought, and my heart sank. I knew, too, perfectly well, even then, that I was monstrously exaggerating the facts, but how could I help it? I could not control myself, and was already shaken with fever, with despair. I pictured to myself how coldly and disdainfully that scoundrel Svorkov would meet me, with what dull-witted, invisible contempt the blockhead Trudolyov would look at me, and what impudent rudeness the insect Ferfitchkin would snigger at me in order to curry favors with Svorkov. How completely Simonov would take it all in, and how he would despise me. for the abjectness of my vanity and lack of spirit, and worst of all, how paltry, unliterary, commonplace it would all be. Of course, the best thing would be not to go at all, but that was most impossible of all. If I feel impelled to do anything, I seem to be pitchforked into it. I should have jeered at myself ever afterwards. So you funked it, you funked it, you funked the real thing. On the contrary, I passionately longed to show all that rabble that I was by no means such a spiritless creature as I seemed to myself. What is more, even in the acutest paroxysm of this cowardly fever, I dreamt of getting the upper hand, of dominating them, carrying them away, making them like me, if only for my elation of thought and unmistakable wit. They would abandon Zverkov. He would sit on the one side silent and ashamed, while I should crush him. Then perhaps we would be reconciled and drink to our everlasting friendship. But what was most bitter and humiliating for me was that I knew, even then, I knew fully and for certain that I needed nothing of all this really, that I did not really want to crush, to subdue, to attract them, and that I did not care a straw really for the result, even if I did achieve it, of how I prayed for the day to pass quickly. In unutterable anguish I went to the window, opened the movable pane, and looked out into the troubled darkness of the thickly filling with snow. At last my wretched little clock hissed out 5. I seized my hat and, trying not to look at the Apollon, who had been all day expecting his month's wages, but in his foolishness was unwilling to be the first to speak about it, I slipped between him and the door, and jumping into a high-class sledge on which I spent my last half-ruble, I drove up in grand style to the Hotel de Paris.